What I'm about to tell you is how my husband's biggest mistake became my greatest triumph, and how one conversation with his lawyer changed everything he thought he knew about power. For privacy reasons, I'll be using pseudonyms throughout this story, as what transpired has legal implications that continue to this day. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. My name is Victoria, and I'm a successful forensic accountant based in the bustling city of Meridian Falls. When people hear forensic accountant, they often think of boring spreadsheets and dusty financial records. What they don't realize is that my job involves uncovering financial crimes, tracking hidden assets, and exposing elaborate schemes that people thought they'd hidden forever. I've built a reputation for finding money that others assumed was untraceable, and my expertise has helped solve cases involving millions of dollars in fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct. My husband, whom I'll call Nathaniel Hartwell, never truly understood or respected what I did for a living. To him, I was just someone who played with numbers while he ran what he considered a real business, a luxury car dealership chain called Hartwell Premium Motors that he had inherited from his father. Nathaniel always made it clear that he viewed his work as more important, more prestigious, and certainly more profitable than mine. He would often introduce me at social gatherings as my wife Victoria. She does something with accounting, dismissing years of specialized education and professional achievements with a casual wave of his hand. What Nathaniel failed to grasp was the true scope of my professional network and influence. In Meridian Falls, forensic accountants like myself work closely with law enforcement, federal agencies, high-profile attorneys, and major corporations. We're called in when other financial professionals hit dead ends. We're the ones who follow the paper trails that others can't see, who understand the intricate web of financial relationships that can make or break legal cases. My reputation in this field wasn't just local. I had contacts throughout the region who knew that when Victoria Ashcroft took on a case, she got results. If you like the story of our channel, please like the channel, and if you are interested in these stories, join our channel membership. Thank you. Our marriage had been deteriorating for months before the final confrontation. Nathaniel had become increasingly distant, critical, and dismissive. He would stay late at the dealership, claiming he was building the business, though I suspected there was more to his absences than work. He had started making snide comments about my appearance, my career, and my contributions to our household. The man who had once claimed to love my intelligence and determination now seemed to view these same qualities as threats to his ego. Living in our sprawling estate in the prestigious Willowbrook Heights neighborhood, I had everything that money could buy, except respect from my own husband. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I spent my days helping others uncover financial deception, I was apparently blind to what was happening in my own marriage. Or perhaps I simply didn't want to see it yet. Nathaniel's business, Hartwell Premium Motors, had 3 locations across Meridian Falls and the surrounding counties. From the outside, it appeared to be thriving. Luxury vehicles lined the lots, the showrooms were always pristine, and Nathaniel carried himself with the confidence of a successful businessman. He loved to boast about his business acumen and how he had expanded his father's legacy. What he didn't know was that my trained eye had begun to notice certain inconsistencies in his lifestyle and spending patterns, inconsistencies that would become crucial later in our story. The final straw came on a cold Tuesday evening in March. I had just returned from a particularly challenging case involving a construction company's fraudulent billing practices when Nathaniel delivered the news that would change both our lives forever. His words were calculated and cruel, designed to make me feel small and powerless. He told me that our marriage was over, that I needed to leave our home, and that his lawyer would handle everything. He spoke as if I were an employee being terminated rather than a wife of 7 years. What Nathaniel didn't realize in that moment was that he had just made the most catastrophic miscalculation of his life. He saw me as a defeated woman with no options and no power. He assumed that my expertise in forensic accounting was irrelevant to our personal situation. He believed that his lawyer would easily handle whatever feeble resistance I might offer. Most importantly, he had no idea that the very skills he had dismissed and belittled for years were about to become the instruments of his downfall. As I listened to his cold, calculated dismissal of our marriage, something clicked into place. In my mind, the same analytical instincts that had helped me solve complex financial crimes were suddenly focused on a new target, understanding exactly what Nathaniel thought he could get away with, and more importantly, what he didn't know. I could uncover. You see, when you've spent years following money trails and exposing hidden assets, you develop certain habits. You notice things. You ask questions. You verify information. And as I stood there listening to my husband explain how his lawyer would handle everything, I realized that Nathaniel had no idea who he was really dealing with. This is the story of how a man who thought he held all the cards discovered that he had been playing against someone who not only knew the game better than he did, but who had been quietly gathering intelligence that would soon turn his world upside down. When Nathaniel told me to talk to his lawyer, he thought he was dismissing a powerless wife. Instead, he was unleashing a forensic accountant who was about to conduct the most personal and devastating investigation of her career. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. Alright, let's get back to it. The signs had been there for months, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious to someone with my training in detecting financial irregularities and behavioral patterns. As a forensic accountant, I was trained to notice discrepancies, and unfortunately, those same skills that made me excellent at my job were now revealing uncomfortable truths about my marriage to IT. Started with Nathaniel's schedule changes. For years, he had maintained relatively predictable hours at Hartwell Premium Motors. He would leave for the main dealership on Riverside Avenue around 8 a.m. and typically return home by 6:30 p.m. Suddenly, in late January, his pattern shifted dramatically. He began leaving earlier, around 7 a.m., claiming he needed to check inventory at the newer locations in Eastbridge and Millfield. More concerning, he started returning home much later, sometimes not until 9 or 10 p.m. When I asked about these extended hours, Nathaniel's explanations were vague and defensive. "You wouldn't understand the car business, Victoria," he would say dismissively. "It takes real relationship building with customers, not sitting behind a desk crunching numbers all day." His tone had an edge to it that hadn't been there before. A subtle hostility that made me increasingly uncomfortable in my own home. The financial inconsistencies were what really caught my attention. As someone who analyzes spending patterns for a living, I couldn't help but notice changes in our household accounts. Nathaniel had always been particular about our finances, insisting on maintaining separate business and personal accounts, which I had respected. However, our joint household account began showing unusual activity. There were frequent cash withdrawals, $300 here, $500 there, always from ATMs near his dealerships, but the amounts and frequency were far beyond his normal patterns. When I casually mentioned noticing the increased cash withdrawals, Nathaniel became defensive, claiming he needed cash for business entertainment and networking events. As someone who had investigated numerous cases of financial impropriety, I knew that excessive cash withdrawals were often a red flag for activities someone wanted to keep hidden. More telling were the credit card charges that began appearing on statements. Expensive restaurants I'd never heard of, located in parts of Meridian Falls that Nathaniel had no business reason to visit. A $400 charge at Belletza, an upscale women's boutique downtown. When I asked about it, he claimed it was a client appreciation gift for the wife of a major customer, but he became agitated when I pressed for details about which customer. There were charges at Serenity Day Spa, multiple visits to high-end jewelry stores, and expensive wine purchases from establishments that catered to romantic dinners rather than business meetings. Each time I brought up these expenses, Nathaniel's explanations became more elaborate and his defensiveness more pronounced. His phone behavior changed dramatically as well. Nathaniel had never been secretive about his phone before, often leaving it casually on counters or asking me to check messages when he was driving. Suddenly, his phone was constantly with him, face down on surfaces, and he had added a passcode that he claimed was for business security. He would step into other rooms to take calls, speaking in hushed tones that he insisted were confidential business discussions. The most obvious sign was his treatment of me. Nathaniel had always been somewhat dismissive of my career, but his attitude escalated to outright hostility. He began making cutting remarks about my appearance, suggesting I had let myself go and that I dressed like a boring accountant. He criticized everything from my hairstyle to my choice of evening entertainment, claiming I was too serious and no fun anymore. What struck me as particularly cruel was how he began undermining my professional accomplishments. When I received recognition for helping solve a major embezzlement case that recovered $2.3 million for a local manufacturing company, Nathaniel's response was, "Must be nice to have such easy work, just following obvious paper trails." When I was invited to speak at the Regional Financial Crimes Conference, he sarcastically commented, "I'm sure all 12 people in the audience will be fascinated by your spreadsheet stories." The physical distance between us became increasingly apparent as well. Nathaniel, who had once been affectionate and attentive, now seemed to avoid any casual contact. He would come to bed later and later, claiming he needed to review dealer reports or prepare for morning meetings. Weekend activities that we had once enjoyed together, hiking the trails around Meridian Falls, visiting the farmers market downtown, or simply watching movies, gradually disappeared from our routine. Perhaps most telling of all was his sudden interest in our legal and financial arrangements. Nathaniel began asking seemingly casual questions about asset division laws in our state, about how business valuations worked in divorce proceedings, and about whether I had ever dealt with complex financial separation cases in my professional work. When I asked why he was curious about such topics, he claimed he was just trying to understand your work better, but the timing felt suspicious. The final warning sign that something was seriously wrong came when I discovered that Nathaniel had been researching divorce attorneys. While using our shared laptop to prepare a presentation for work, I noticed in the browser history that someone had been visiting websites for several prominent family law firms in Meridian Falls. The searches included specific queries about high-asset divorce, business protection in divorce, and minimizing spousal support obligations. As someone trained to piece together evidence and identify patterns of deceptive behavior, I knew exactly what I was looking at. The extended hours, the unexplained expenses, the secretive phone calls, the emotional distance, and now the legal research, it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Nathaniel was planning to leave me, and he was doing everything possible to position himself advantageously for the divorce he was apparently planning to initiate. What Nathaniel didn't realize was that while he was busy researching how to protect his assets from me, I was unconsciously cataloging every suspicious behavior, every financial irregularity, and every piece of evidence that would soon become crucial to understanding the full scope of what he was planning. My forensic accounting instincts were building a case file in my mind, and soon, I would need every detail I had observed. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in early March when I decided I could no longer ignore the mountain of evidence that had been accumulating. I had spent weeks observing, cataloging, and trying to give Nathaniel the benefit of the doubt, but my professional instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. As someone who had built a career on confronting people with uncomfortable financial truths, I knew it was time to apply those same direct tactics to my personal life. Nathaniel arrived home that evening at 9:47 p.m., nearly 2 hours later than his claimed meeting schedule would have allowed. His shirt was wrinkled in a way that suggested it had been hastily straightened, and there was a faint scent of perfume that definitely wasn't mine, something floral and expensive that I didn't recognize. When he walked through our front door into the marble-floored foyer, he seemed surprised to find me waiting in the living room instead of already having gone to bed. "Victoria, you're still up," he said, his tone carefully neutral but with an underlying tension that I had learned to recognize. "I thought you'd be asleep by now. You know how early you like to get to the office." I had positioned myself strategically in the chair that faced the entrance, the same way I arranged myself before difficult questioning sessions with suspected fraudsters. My laptop was open on the coffee table, displaying a spreadsheet I had created tracking his suspicious expenses and timeline discrepancies. I had learned long ago that presenting data visually often prompted more honest responses than accusations without evidence. "Nathaniel, we need to talk," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. "I've been noticing some patterns in your behavior and our finances that concern me, and I think it's time we address them directly." His reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of curiosity or concern about what might be troubling me, his face hardened and his posture became defensive. In my professional experience, innocent people typically responded to financial questions with confusion or eagerness to clarify misunderstandings. Guilty parties became defensive and evasive. "Patterns," he repeated, moving toward the bar cart near our floor-to-ceiling windows. "What kind of patterns? And why are you analyzing our personal finances like one of your fraud cases?" The fact that he immediately understood I was treating this like an investigation told me everything I needed to know. An innocent spouse would have been confused by such an approach, not immediately defensive about being analyzed. I turned my laptop screen toward him, showing the carefully organized timeline I had created. "I'm talking about $4,200 in unexplained cash withdrawals over the past 6 weeks, credit card charges at restaurants you've never taken me to, purchases at jewelry stores and spas that you can't adequately explain, and a dramatic change in your schedule that doesn't align with any business needs I can verify." Nathaniel poured himself a generous glass of the expensive scotch he kept for special occasions, his hand trembling slightly. "Victoria, you're being paranoid. I'm working harder than ever to grow the business. Sometimes that means entertaining potential clients, networking events, business gifts. I can't believe you're sitting here treating me like a criminal." "I'm treating you like someone whose financial behavior has changed dramatically and who has been lying to his wife about his whereabouts," I replied, maintaining the same steady tone I used during depositions. The Bellezza Boutique charge was made at 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday when you told me you were at the Eastbridge location reviewing inventory. I called that location to confirm, and they said you were never there that day." His face flushed red, and I could see the moment he realized that my investigative skills were far more thorough than he had anticipated. "You called my dealership? You're checking up on me like I'm some kind of suspect?" "I'm verifying information because the numbers don't add up, Nathaniel. It's what I do for a living, and it's what I'm trained to notice." I pulled up another screen showing his phone usage patterns. "Your phone records show extended calls to a number registered to someone named Camille Richardson. These calls happened during times you've told me you were in business meetings." The Scotch glass froze halfway to his lips. The name had clearly caught him off guard, and I could see him rapidly calculating how much I might know and how I could have accessed phone records. What he didn't realize was that I had simply used the same techniques I employed in professional investigations: careful observation, pattern analysis, and strategic information gathering. "How did you get phone records?" he demanded, his voice rising. "That's an invasion of privacy, Victoria. You had no right to. I have access to our joint account statements, which include detailed phone bills," I interrupted. "The same bills that show 47 calls to Camille Richardson over the past month, many lasting over an hour. Would you like to explain who she is and why you're spending more time talking to her than you spend talking to your wife?" The mask of righteous indignation was beginning to slip, and I could see the calculating look that crossed his features. In fraud investigations, this was the moment when perpetrators typically chose between doubling down on their lies or attempting to minimize their actions through partial admissions. Nathaniel chose to attack. "You know what, Victoria? Yes, I've been talking to Camille. She's someone who actually appreciates me and doesn't treat me like a suspect in my own home. She's beautiful, successful, and she doesn't spend her evenings creating spreadsheets to analyze my every move." The admission hit exactly as he intended it to, like a physical blow. But years of maintaining composure during difficult professional confrontations had taught me not to react emotionally when someone was trying to hurt me strategically. "So you admit you're having an affair," I said, making a note on my laptop. "Thank you for confirming that. Now let's discuss the financial implications." My clinical response clearly wasn't what he had expected. He seemed to have anticipated tears, pleading, or emotional breakdown that would allow him to position himself as the victim of an unreasonable wife. "Financial implications?" he sputtered. "I just told you I'm seeing someone else, and you're worried about money?" "I'm worried about the fact that you've been using our joint accounts to fund this affair," I replied. "The dinners, the gifts, the spa treatments you've been paying for. You've been stealing from our marital assets to finance your relationship with this woman." "Stealing?" His voice rose to nearly a shout. "It's my money, Victoria. I earned it, I built that business, and I can spend it however I want." "Actually, Nathaniel, that's not legally accurate. We live in an equitable distribution state, and marital assets include business income earned during the marriage. More importantly, you've been systematically deceiving me while using our shared resources to support another relationship." I could see him struggling to regain control of a conversation that wasn't going the way he had planned. He set down his scotch glass with excessive force, causing some of the liquid to splash onto our antique side table. "Fine, Victoria. You want to make this about money and legal technicalities? Maybe this marriage has run its course. Maybe we both need to seriously consider whether we want to continue living like this." The threat was unmistakable, but instead of the fear he probably expected to see, I felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was finally coming out, and now I could stop pretending that subtle signs and suspicious behavior were just my imagination. "Are you threatening divorce, Nathaniel?" I asked, continuing to type notes into my laptop. "I'm saying that maybe. It's time we both admitted this isn't working," he replied, his tone becoming colder and more calculated. "You're obviously unhappy, I'm obviously unhappy, and maybe it's time to explore our options." What Nathaniel didn't realize was that by confirming the affair and now threatening divorce, he had just provided me with exactly the ammunition I would need for what was coming next. As a forensic accountant who had worked on numerous divorce cases, I understood precisely what exploring our options meant in legal terms, and I was already several steps ahead of him in that particular game. The next morning, I woke up to find Nathaniel already dressed in his most expensive suit, the charcoal gray Armani he typically reserved for his most important business presentations. He was standing by our bedroom window overlooking the manicured gardens of Willowbrook Heights, speaking quietly into his phone. When he noticed I was awake, he ended the call abruptly and turned to face me with an expression I had never seen before, cold, determined, and completely devoid of any warmth or familiarity. "Victoria, we need to finish our conversation from last night," he said, his tone businesslike and detached. "I've done some thinking, and I believe it's time we stop pretending this marriage is salvageable." I sat up in bed, immediately alert. In my professional experience, when someone opened a conversation with "I've done some thinking" after a contentious confrontation, they had usually spent the intervening time consulting with advisors and formulating a strategy. The expensive suit and early morning phone call suggested this wasn't going to be a discussion, it was going to be a presentation of predetermined decisions. "I'm listening," I said carefully, reaching for my robe. Something about his demeanor made me want to be fully dressed for whatever was coming. Nathaniel moved to our sitting area and positioned himself in the chair that usually served as my reading spot, a deliberate choice that felt like a territorial claim. He had a manila folder in his hand that I hadn't noticed before, and he placed it on the side table with ceremonial precision. "Last night you made it clear that you don't trust me, that you're willing to spy on me, and that you view our marriage as some kind of financial transaction to be audited and analyzed," he began, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed these words. "You've turned our home into an interrogation room and our relationship into a case study. That's not a marriage, Victoria. That's a business arrangement that's outlived its usefulness." The way he framed my discovery of his affair as the problem, rather than the affair itself, was both masterful and nauseating. He was attempting to rewrite the narrative, positioning my investigation as the betrayal rather than his infidelity. "So what are you saying, Nathaniel?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this was heading. He opened the manila folder and removed a set of documents that looked official and formal. "I'm saying that I want a divorce, Victoria. I've already consulted with Harrison, Blackstone and Associates. They're the premier family law firm in Meridian Falls. My attorney, Richard Caldwell, has assured me that we can handle this quickly and amicably if you're reasonable about the process." The casual mention of having already hired an attorney hit me like a physical blow. While I had been agonizing over the signs of his affair and trying to salvage our marriage, he had already moved into divorce planning mode. The phone call this morning had likely been with his lawyer, finalizing whatever strategy they had developed. "You've already hired a divorce attorney?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. "I've consulted with one, yes. Given your behavior last night, the accusations, the surveillance, the hostile interrogation, I think it's clear that we need legal guidance to navigate this separation properly." He leaned forward, and I could see something that looked almost like satisfaction in his eyes. "Victoria, I'm not going to pretend this hasn't been coming for a long time. We've grown apart, we want different things, and frankly, I don't think you're the right partner for where my life is heading." The cruelty of that statement took my breath away. After 7 years of marriage, countless shared experiences, and what I had believed was genuine partnership, he was dismissing me like an employee whose skills were no longer relevant to the company's direction. "Where your life is heading?" I repeated, trying to process the calculated coldness of his words. "My business is expanding, Victoria. Hartwell Premium Motors is about to become a regional powerhouse. I'm negotiating deals that will triple our revenue within 2 years. I need a partner who can match that energy, someone who can represent the Hartwell name at the level it deserves. He paused for effect, and I could see him savoring what came next. Camille understands that world. She's sophisticated, she's beautiful, and she knows how to be the kind of wife that a successful businessman needs. The mention of Camille, delivered with such obvious pride and affection, felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But it was his next words that delivered the truly devastating blow. Let's be honest about what this marriage has really been, Victoria. You've been coasting on my success for years, living in this house that my business pays for, enjoying a lifestyle that your little accounting job could never provide. You've contributed nothing meaningful to building what we have here. I felt the blood drain from my face. Nathaniel, that's not true. I've supported your business, you've. What? He interrupted, his voice rising with what seemed like genuine anger. You've questioned my decisions, criticized my expansion plans, and made it clear that you think you know better than I do about running a business. You've been dead weight, Victoria, and I'm tired of carrying you. The attack on my professional competence was clearly calculated to hurt me in the deepest way possible. He knew how hard I had worked to build my career, how proud I was of my expertise, and how much my professional identity meant to me. Your forensic accounting career, he continued, making air quotes around the words, is basically just fancy bookkeeping. You look at numbers that other people create and point out problems that other people have to solve. You don't build anything, Victoria. You don't create value. You just criticize and analyze and find fault. Each word was delivered like a precisely aimed dart, designed to destroy my confidence and sense of self-worth. I could see that this wasn't an emotional outburst, this was a systematic demolition job, probably planned and perhaps even rehearsed. Camille, on the other hand, owns her own marketing agency. She understands what it takes to build something from nothing, to take risks, to make the hard decisions that create real success. She's a partner in every sense of the word, not just someone who lives off someone else's achievements. The comparison was brutal and deliberate. He wasn't just telling me he wanted a divorce, he was explaining in excruciating detail why I was inadequate, replaceable, and essentially worthless as a wife and partner. So here's what's going to happen, he said, sliding the documents across to me. I'm filing for divorce. My attorney has prepared preliminary paperwork that outlines a fair settlement. You'll get a reasonable amount to help you transition to single life, and we can both move on without unnecessary drama. I looked down at the papers without really seeing them. The formal legal language blurred together as I tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. The man I had loved and trusted for 7 years had just delivered the most comprehensive character assassination I could imagine, while simultaneously announcing that he was replacing me with someone he considered superior in every way. I know. This is probably shocking, Victoria, but honestly, I think you'll be happier in the long run. You can find someone more compatible with your lifestyle and ambitions. Someone who appreciates spreadsheets and financial analysis as much as you do. The condescending tone made it clear that he viewed my future prospects as limited and unimpressive. In his mind, I was being discarded for good reason, and I should be grateful for whatever settlement he was willing to offer. I'd like you to review those documents today and get back to me through my attorney. Richard Caldwell's contact information is on the cover letter. He's expecting your call. Nathaniel stood up and straightened his suit jacket, preparing to leave for what I assumed was a celebration of his newfound freedom. As he walked toward the door, he paused and delivered one final devastating blow. Oh, and Victoria? I'd appreciate it if you could start making arrangements to move out of the house. I know this is difficult, but I think it's best if we minimize contact during this process. Camille will be spending more time here, and I'd rather avoid any uncomfortable situations. The realization that he was planning to move his mistress into our marital home, perhaps as early as this weekend, was the final insult. He wasn't just divorcing me. He was erasing me completely, replacing me so thoroughly that even my physical presence in our shared space was inconvenient to his new life plan. As the door closed behind him, I sat in stunned silence, holding divorce papers that I hadn't asked for and contemplating a future that had been decided without my input. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely powerless and utterly defeated. After Nathaniel left that morning, I spent nearly an hour sitting in our bedroom, staring at the divorce papers without really processing their contents. The shock of his calculated cruelty had left me feeling numb and disoriented. But as the initial emotional impact began to wear off, something else started to take its place, the analytical mindset that had served me throughout my career. Almost unconsciously, I began to shift from devastated wife to forensic accountant. And that change in perspective would prove to be Nathaniel's first critical miscalculation. I moved to my home office, a space Nathaniel had always dismissed as my number-crunching corner, and spread the divorce documents across my desk. As I began to read through them properly, my professional training kicked in automatically. I found myself analyzing the paperwork the same way I would examine financial documents in a fraud investigation, looking for inconsistencies, omissions, and anything that didn't align with the facts as I understood them. The preliminary settlement offer was insulting but not unexpected. Nathaniel's attorney had proposed that I receive $75,000 in cash, my personal vehicle, and my personal belongings. In exchange, I would relinquish all claims to our house, Nathaniel's business interests, his investment portfolio, and any future support payments. For someone who had contributed 7 years to building what we had together, it was barely enough to rent a modest apartment for 2 years, but it wasn't the lowball offer that caught my attention, it was what the documents didn't mention. As someone who had worked on numerous high-asset divorce cases, I knew exactly what information should have been included in preliminary financial disclosures. Nathaniel's filing contained only the most basic overview of his assets, with no detailed business valuations, no comprehensive list of investment accounts, and no mention of several financial arrangements that I knew existed. More importantly, there was absolutely no reference to the financial agreements we had signed when we married. I walked to our bedroom closet and retrieved the fireproof safe where we kept our most important documents. Inside, beneath our passports and insurance policies, was a folder I hadn't opened in years. When Nathaniel had inherited Hartwell Premium Motors from his father, the business had come with significant debt and legal complications. His father's attorney had strongly recommended that we sign a comprehensive prenuptial agreement before our marriage, but Nathaniel had been adamantly opposed to the idea. "I don't want our marriage to start with the assumption that it might fail," he had insisted. "Prenups are for people who don't trust each other." Instead, we had worked with a family law attorney to create what was called a postnuptial agreement, a contract signed after marriage that outlined how our assets would be divided in various scenarios. At the time, Nathaniel's business was struggling, and he was terrified that a divorce could force him to sell the dealerships to pay settlement costs. The agreement we signed was designed to protect both of us, but it contained provisions that I was certain Nathaniel had forgotten about in the intervening years. As I read through the document, I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began, hope mixed with grim satisfaction. The postnuptial agreement contained several clauses that were highly favorable to me, including one that Nathaniel himself had insisted upon when his business was in a precarious financial position. The most significant provision stated that if Either party engaged in marital misconduct including but not limited to adultery, financial deception, or abandonment, the injured party would be entitled to 60% of all marital assets, including business interests, real estate, and investment accounts. At the time we signed it, Nathaniel had been worried about protecting himself if I ever left him for someone wealthier. He never imagined that he would be the one committing adultery. Even more favorable was a clause regarding business valuation. The agreement specified that in the event of divorce, Hartwell Premium Motors would be valued not just on its current assets, but on its projected future earnings based on existing contracts and expansion plans. Nathaniel had insisted on this provision because he was confident the business would grow substantially, and he wanted to ensure that any future ex-wife couldn't claim a share of success she hadn't helped build. The irony was breathtaking, but the provision that made me actually smile for the first time in days was buried in the financial disclosure requirements. The agreement mandated that in any divorce proceeding, both parties must provide complete and accurate financial documentation. Going back 5 years, including all business records, personal accounts, investment statements, and expenditure records. Any attempt to hide assets or provide incomplete information would result in automatic forfeiture of the deceptive party's right to spousal support and would trigger penalty clauses that could increase the other party's settlement by up to 25%. As someone who had built a career on following financial paper trails, I realized that Nathaniel had just handed me a treasure map to every asset he thought he could hide. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the post-nuptial agreement and cross-referencing it with the preliminary divorce filing. The discrepancies were staggering. Nathaniel's attorney had clearly prepared the initial offer based on incomplete information, probably assuming that I would be too emotional or uninformed to recognize what was missing. The business valuation alone was grossly understated. The documents claimed Hartwell Premium Motors was worth approximately $1.2 million, but I knew from conversations over the years that Nathaniel had recently secured contracts with luxury car manufacturers that would increase the dealership's value exponentially. He had bragged just 6 months ago about landing an exclusive regional distributorship deal that he claimed was worth millions over the next 5 years. More telling were the missing investment accounts. I knew Nathaniel had been moving money into various investment vehicles, including a substantial cryptocurrency portfolio and several high-yield business investment funds. None of these appeared in his financial disclosure, suggesting that he was either planning to hide them or had already moved them to accounts I didn't know about. The real revelation came when I started thinking about his recent behavior through the lens of financial preparation for divorce. The increased cash withdrawals, the expensive gifts for Camille, the sudden business trips, it was possible that Nathaniel had been systematically moving assets and establishing financial arrangements that he thought would be invisible to me and my eventual attorney. What he didn't realize was that his wife wasn't just any divorced spouse, she was a forensic accountant whose specialty was uncovering exactly the kind of financial manipulation he was likely attempting to. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and began creating what I mentally called the Nathaniel file. Using the same methodical approach I employed in professional investigations, I started documenting every financial discrepancy I could identify, every asset that should have been disclosed but wasn't, and every transaction pattern that suggested deliberate concealment. The more I worked, the more I realized that Nathaniel's confidence in his divorce strategy was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who he was dealing with. He saw me as a dependent wife who would be grateful for whatever settlement he offered. He had no idea that he was essentially challenging a financial detective to uncover secrets that he thought were safely hidden. By early afternoon, I had filled 12 pages with notes about potential asset concealment, business valuation discrepancies, and violation of our post-nuptial agreement terms. Each item represented not just a financial asset I was entitled to, but evidence that Nathaniel had been planning this divorce far longer than his performance this morning had suggested. The most satisfying realization was that by filing for divorce first and presenting such an obviously inadequate settlement offer, Nathaniel had essentially declared war on someone whose professional reputation was built on winning exactly these kinds of financial battles. As I organized my notes and prepared to make some very important phone calls, I couldn't help but appreciate the poetic justice of the situation. Nathaniel had dismissed my career as fancy bookkeeping and claimed I didn't create value. He was about to discover exactly how much value a skilled forensic accountant could extract from someone who thought he was smarter than she was. The man who had called me dead weight this morning had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had assumed that his victim was powerless, when in reality, he had just handed a loaded weapon to someone who knew exactly how to use it, armed with the knowledge of the post-nuptial agreement and a clear understanding of Nathaniel's miscalculations. I spent the rest of Friday afternoon transforming from a devastated wife into what I did best, a methodical financial investigator preparing for the most important case of my career. The first step was assembling a team of professionals who could help me navigate this battle, and more importantly, who understood exactly what Nathaniel was up against. My first call was to Elena Vasquez, the most respected family law attorney in Meridian Falls and someone I had worked with on several high-asset divorce cases over the years. Elena specialized in complex financial divorces, and she had seen me present evidence that had completely reversed seemingly hopeless cases. When her secretary put me through immediately, I knew my professional reputation was about to become my personal salvation. "Victoria, what a pleasant surprise," Elena said warmly. "How can I help you today?" "I need to hire you for a personal matter, Elena. My husband filed for divorce yesterday, and I have reason to believe he's attempting to conceal significant marital assets." There was a brief pause before Elena's voice took on the sharp, focused tone I recognized from our professional collaborations. "I see. And I'm assuming this isn't a simple case of hurt feelings and equal asset division?" "Not exactly. He's committed adultery, violated our post-nuptial agreement, and filed preliminary papers that understate his assets by what I estimate to be several $1,000,000. He's also made the mistake of assuming that his wife is just a helpless victim, rather than someone who specializes in uncovering financial fraud." Elena's laugh was genuinely delighted. "Oh, this poor man has no idea what he's walked into, does he? Can you be in my office Monday morning at 9 a.m.? I want to see everything you've documented so far." "I'll be there." "And Elena?" "His attorney is Richard Caldwell from Harrison, Blackstone and Associates. Richard's a decent lawyer, but he's used to dealing with emotional divorces and intimidated spouses. He has no experience handling cases where the opposing party is a forensic accountant who knows how to build an airtight case. This should be interesting." After scheduling the meeting with Elena, I began the process of securing and documenting evidence. My years of investigating financial crimes had taught me that the most critical phase of any case was the initial evidence preservation period. People attempting to hide assets typically moved quickly once they realized they were under scrutiny, so I had a limited window to capture information before Nathaniel became aware that I was building a case against him. I started with our joint financial accounts, printing comprehensive statements for the past 2 years and highlighting every transaction that would support my case. The pattern of increased spending on Camille was even more obvious when viewed chronologically: restaurant bills, hotel charges, jewelry purchases, and cash withdrawals that corresponded perfectly with his claimed business trips. Next, I accessed our shared computer and began copying files related to Nathaniel's business operations. As his wife, I had legitimate access to this information, and I knew that once divorce proceedings began in earnest, this access would likely be revoked. I found spreadsheets showing revenue projections that were significantly higher than what appeared in his divorce filing, correspondence about the luxury car manufacturer contracts he had mentioned, and most damaging of all, Emails discussing asset protection strategies with a financial advisor I had never heard of. The most revealing discovery came when I found a folder labeled Contingency Planning that contained documents Nathaniel had clearly never intended for me to see. Inside were communications with a business attorney about restructuring Hartwell Premium Motors to minimize potential divorce exposure, research about offshore investment accounts, and most incriminating of all, a timeline for transitioning personal assets that began 6 months before he had filed for divorce. This wasn't a man who had suddenly decided his marriage was over. This was someone who had been systematically planning his exit strategy. While lying to my face about our relationship problems, I spent Saturday morning visiting our various bank branches and investment firms, requesting detailed account histories and transaction records. As a joint account holder, I had every right to this information, and I wanted to create a complete financial picture before Nathaniel realized what I was doing. At Meridian First National, where Nathaniel kept his primary business accounts, I discovered something that made my hands shake with anger. He had opened 3 new business accounts in the past 4 months, all under subsidiary companies I had never heard of. The account activity showed substantial transfers from the main Hartwell Premium Motors accounts into these new entities. When I asked the banker about the purpose of these companies, she mentioned that they were established for business expansion and investment diversification. What Nathaniel didn't realize was that creating shell companies to hide assets during marriage was exactly the kind of financial manipulation I had been trained to detect and prosecute. Every transfer, every new account, every attempt at concealment was actually creating evidence that would support my case under the post-nuptial agreement's penalty clauses. By Saturday afternoon, I had assembled a comprehensive file that told a clear story. Nathaniel had been planning this divorce for months, systematically moving assets into accounts he thought I didn't know about, undervaluing his business interests, and using marital funds to support his relationship with Camille. Each action violated multiple provisions of our post-nuptial agreement and would likely result in financial penalties that would far exceed anything he had planned for, but documenting his financial misconduct was only part of my preparation strategy. I also needed to secure evidence of his adultery, both to satisfy the post-nuptial agreement requirements and to ensure that his character would be clearly established if we ended up in court. I contacted Marcus Chin, a private investigator I had worked with on several corporate fraud cases. Marcus specialized in surveillance and evidence gathering, and he had often praised my ability to identify exactly what kind of evidence would be most useful in legal proceedings. "Victoria, always a pleasure to hear from you," Marcus said when I called Saturday evening. "What kind of investigation are we looking at?" "Personal this time, Marcus. I need documentation of my husband's adultery for divorce proceedings. I have dates, times, locations, and the identity of the other party. I need photographic evidence and documentation that will hold up in court." Adultery documentation is straightforward, but I'm guessing this isn't a standard divorce case if you're involved. Let's just say that my husband has significantly underestimated both his wife's professional capabilities and the legal protections she put in place years ago. I need evidence that's absolutely bulletproof because the financial stakes are going to be much higher than he realizes. Marcus agreed to begin surveillance immediately, focusing on documenting Nathaniel's relationship with Camille and capturing evidence of their affair that would satisfy any legal standard. Sunday, I spent preparing for my meeting with Elena by organizing all the evidence I had gathered into a comprehensive presentation. I created timelines, financial analyses, and evidence summaries that clearly showed the scope of Nathaniel's deception and the strength of my legal position. As I worked, I realized that I felt more energized and focused than I had in months. The devastating emotional blow of Nathaniel's cruel dismissal had been replaced by the satisfaction of building an unassailable case against someone who had underestimated my capabilities so completely, the man who had called me dead weight and claimed I contributed nothing meaningful was about to discover that his wife had been quietly assembling the tools that would dismantle his entire divorce strategy. He thought he was dealing with a powerless victim who would gratefully accept whatever settlement he offered. Instead, he had challenged a forensic accountant to a financial battle, and he had given me months of evidence to use against him. By Sunday evening, I had built a case file that would have impressed my most demanding corporate clients, and I was ready to show Nathaniel's attorney exactly what kind of opponent they were really facing, the scared, devastated woman from Friday. Morning was gone. In her place was a strategic professional who was about to demonstrate why nobody in Meridian Falls wanted to be on the wrong side of Victoria Ashcroft's investigative skills. Monday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather and crystal-clear skies, the kind of day that seemed to promise good things ahead. I dressed carefully in my most authoritative business suit, a navy blue ensemble that I typically wore. When presenting findings in high-stakes fraud cases, today's presentation would be the most important of my career, and I wanted to project absolute confidence and competence. Elena Vasquez's law office occupied the top 3 floors of the Meridian Tower, the most prestigious office building in downtown Meridian Falls. Her corner office overlooked the Millbrook River and the historic district. And the walls were lined with awards, certifications, and photographs of Elena with various judges and legal luminaries. This was exactly the kind of environment where my professional reputation would carry maximum weight. "Victoria, you look ready for battle," Elena said as her assistant showed me into the office. "I have to admit, I've been looking forward to this meeting since Friday. It's not often I get to work with someone who can build a case file this thoroughly before we even meet." I placed 3 thick binders on her conference table, each labeled and organized according to different aspects of Nathaniel's deception. "Elena, what I'm about to show you represents the most comprehensive documentation of pre-divorce asset manipulation I've ever assembled. Nathaniel has violated virtually every provision of our post-nuptial agreement, and he's done it so systematically that I believe we can prove this was a planned financial attack rather than a simple marital breakdown." For the next hour, I walked Elena through every piece of evidence I had gathered. Her expressions shifted from professional interest to amazement to what I can only describe as predatory satisfaction as she realized the strength of the case I had built. "Victoria, this is extraordinary work. The shell company documentation alone would be sufficient to trigger the penalty clauses in your post-nuptial agreement. But the timeline you've established showing that he began moving assets 6 months before filing for divorce, that transforms this from a simple adultery case into systematic financial fraud." "It gets better," I said, opening the 3rd binder. "I've also documented approximately $127,000 in marital funds that he spent on his affair with Camille Richardson. Restaurant bills, hotel rooms, jewelry, a weekend trip to the Hamptons, and a substantial monthly allowance he's been paying her. Every dollar can be traced back to our joint accounts or business revenue." Elena studied the financial records with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. "And you've verified that all of the spending occurred while he was still married to you and using marital assets?" "Every transaction is documented with dates, account sources, and in many cases, photographic evidence of him with Camille at the locations where the charges occurred. My private investigator has been very thorough." "Victoria, I need you to understand something," Elena said, leaning back in her chair. "Based on what you've shown me here, we're not just talking about a favorable divorce settlement. Under the terms of your postnuptial agreement, Nathaniel's actions could result in him forfeiting his right to spousal support, paying substantial penalties, and potentially losing majority control of his own business." The satisfaction I felt at hearing those words was almost overwhelming. "So we have a strong case?" "Strong? Victoria, this isn't just strong, this is overwhelming. The only question now is whether Nathaniel's attorney understands what he's up against, or if he's operating under the same misconceptions as his client." Elena reached for her phone. I think it's time to introduce ourselves to Richard Caldwell. I'm going to call Harrison, Blackstone and Associates and request an immediate meeting to discuss settlement options. I suspect Mr. Caldwell is going to be very surprised by what we have to show him. The call to Richard Caldwell's office was brief and professional. Elena explained that she was representing Mrs. Victoria Ashcroft in response to the divorce filing, and that she had significant concerns about the accuracy and completeness of the preliminary financial disclosures. She requested a meeting for that afternoon to discuss these discrepancies before proceeding with formal litigation. What Elena didn't mention was exactly who Victoria Ashcroft was or what kind of evidence we had assembled. I could only imagine Richard Caldwell's assumption that this would be a routine meeting with an emotional wife and her attorney to negotiate minor adjustments to an already generous settlement offer. The meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. at Harrison, Blackstone and Associates offices in the financial district. Elena and I spent the remaining morning hours preparing our presentation strategy and discussing exactly how much information to reveal initially. The key, Elena explained, is to let them demonstrate their assumptions about who they're dealing with before we show our hand. I want to see how confident they are in their current position before we destroy it completely. At 2:45 p.m., Elena and I arrived at the offices of Harrison, Blackstone and Associates. The firm occupied 2 floors of a converted Victorian mansion, and everything about the environment projected old money respectability and traditional legal practice. Richard Caldwell's office was exactly what I expected: leather-bound books, expensive furniture, and the kind of formal atmosphere designed to intimidate opposing parties into accepting unfavorable settlements. Richard Caldwell himself was in his late 50s, impeccably dressed, and radiated the kind of confidence that comes from decades of successful legal practice. When we were shown into his office, he greeted Elena with professional courtesy and extended his hand to me with what I recognized as carefully calculated sympathy. "Mrs. Ashcroft, I'm very sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. I know this must be a difficult time for you, but I want you to know that we're committed to handling this matter as efficiently and amicably as possible." The condescending tone was unmistakable. He was treating me exactly as Nathaniel had predicted, as an emotional victim who needed to be managed rather than a professional adversary who needed to be respected. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," I replied evenly. "I appreciate your concern, though I should mention that I'm looking forward to reviewing the financial documentation your client provided. As a forensic accountant, I'm always interested in examining how assets are presented in legal proceedings." The change in Richard's expression was immediate and subtle. The mention of my profession had clearly caught him off guard, though he recovered quickly. "Forensic accountant? I wasn't aware of your professional background, Mrs. Ashcroft." "That's certainly interesting." Elena stepped in smoothly. "Richard, Victoria has some concerns about the preliminary financial disclosures in your client's filing. We were hoping you could clarify a few discrepancies we've identified." "Of course," Richard said, though I could see him mentally recalculating his approach. "What kind of discrepancies are we talking about?" I opened my briefcase and removed a single document, a summary sheet showing the differences between Nathaniel's stated business valuation and the actual projected revenue based on his recent contracts. "Well, for starters, your client valued Hartwell Premium Motors at $1.2 million, but the exclusive distributorship agreements he signed in the past 6 months have a projected value of $3.8 million over the next 5 years. I'm curious about how that discrepancy occurred." Richard studied the document, and I could see him realizing that this wasn't going to be the simple negotiation he had expected. "Mrs. Ashcroft, business valuations can be quite complex and projected. Revenues are often speculative. I agree completely, I interrupted. That's why I was surprised to see that your client failed to mention these contracts at all in his financial disclosure. In fact, there seem to be several significant omissions in his asset reporting. Elena placed a second document on Richard's desk. We've also identified 3 subsidiary companies that your client established in the past 4 months, with combined assets of approximately $890,000 that don't appear anywhere in his filing. The color began to drain from Richard's face as he realized the scope of what we had uncovered. Mrs. Ashcroft, how did you obtain information about business subsidiary companies? The same way I obtain information about hidden assets in any investigation, Mr. Caldwell. Through careful research, document analysis, and following financial paper trails. It's what I do for a living. Elena leaned forward slightly. Richard, we need to discuss the postnuptial agreement that your client apparently forgot to mention. Are you familiar with the financial disclosure requirements and penalty clauses contained in that document? The silence that followed was telling. Richard was clearly scrambling to understand how his seemingly straightforward divorce case had suddenly become a complex financial investigation led by someone who specialized in exactly this kind of asset recovery. I think, Richard said carefully, that we may need to schedule a follow-up meeting once I've had a chance to review these materials more thoroughly with my client. Of course, Elena replied pleasantly. Take all the time you need. We'll be filing our preliminary response next week, including a complete forensic analysis of your client's financial misconduct and a detailed accounting of the marital funds he spent on his extramarital affair. As we prepared to leave, I couldn't resist one final observation. Mr. Caldwell, you might want to advise your client that attempting to hide assets from a forensic accountant is roughly equivalent to trying to hide evidence from a detective. We're professionally trained to find things that people want to keep secret. The look of dawning horror on Richard Caldwell's face as we walked out of his office told me everything I needed to know about how the rest of this case would unfold. The first sign that Nathaniel's carefully constructed divorce strategy was falling apart came at 6:47 a.m. on Tuesday morning, when my phone rang with his number displayed on the caller ID. I had been expecting this call since leaving Richard Caldwell's office the previous afternoon, but I was surprised it had taken less than 16 hours for the panic to set in. Victoria, we need to talk immediately. Nathaniel's voice was strained and lacked the confident authority he had projected during our last conversation. There seems to be some kind of misunderstanding about our divorce proceedings. Good morning, Nathaniel, I replied calmly, deliberately maintaining the composed tone I used during professional depositions. I'm not sure what misunderstanding you're referring to. I thought you made your position quite clear when you filed for divorce. My attorney says you hired Elena Vasquez and that you've been making some kind of accusations about my business finances. He says you're claiming I've hidden assets or something ridiculous like that. The fact that he was calling me directly, despite having insisted that all communication go through attorneys, told me everything I needed to know about how badly yesterday's meeting had shaken him. Richard Caldwell had clearly delivered news that had sent Nathaniel into full crisis mode. I haven't made any accusations, Nathaniel. I simply provided my attorney with factual information about discrepancies between your financial disclosure and the actual state of your assets. As a forensic accountant, I have a professional obligation to ensure that financial documentation is accurate and complete. There was a long pause before Nathaniel spoke again, and when he did, his voice had taken on a desperate edge that I had never heard before. Victoria, I think there's been a misunderstanding about some of the business reorganization I've been doing. Maybe we should sit down together and clear this up before it gets out of hand. Business reorganization? I repeated, allowing a note of professional curiosity to enter my voice. Are you referring to the 3 subsidiary companies you established without disclosing them in your divorce filing? Or are you talking about the $890,000 in assets you transferred to those companies during our marriage? The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line confirmed that Richard Caldwell had indeed shared the full scope of what Elena and I had presented. Nathaniel was beginning to understand that his wife had uncovered far more than he had thought possible. Look, Victoria, maybe I didn't explain the business situation as clearly as I should have. Some of those changes were recommended by my financial advisor for tax purposes, and I didn't think they were relevant to our personal situation. The attempt to minimize his actions as innocent business decisions was exactly what I had expected. In my professional experience, people caught in financial deception always tried to reframe their actions as legitimate business practices that had been misunderstood. I see, I said neutrally. And would these tax purposes also explain why you spent $127,000 of our marital assets on your relationship with Camille Richardson? Because I'm having trouble understanding the business justification for those expenses. The silence that followed was so complete that I briefly wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. How do you know about? How did you get that information? The same way I obtain financial information in any investigation, Nathaniel. Through careful documentation, transaction analysis, and following paper trails. It's what I do for a living, remember? The job you described as fancy bookkeeping. And contributing nothing meaningful. I could hear him moving around, probably pacing in his office or bedroom, as the full implications of his situation began to sink in. Victoria, we need to find a way to work this out reasonably. I'm sure we can come to some kind of understanding that makes sense for both of us. I'm certainly open to reasonable discussions, Nathaniel. Though I should mention that Elena has identified several violations of our postnuptial agreement that carry automatic penalty clauses. Have you reviewed that document recently? Postnuptial agreement? What are you talking about? The genuine confusion in his voice told me that he had completely forgotten about the comprehensive financial agreement we had signed 7 years ago. This was perhaps the most satisfying moment of the entire process, realizing that Nathaniel had built his entire divorce strategy without considering the legal protections I had in place. The agreement we signed when you inherited your father's business, Nathaniel. The one that includes specific provisions about adultery, asset concealment, and financial disclosure requirements. Your attorney should have a copy in his files. I could hear papers rustling in the background as Nathaniel apparently began searching through documents. I don't understand. That was just some paperwork about protecting the business if anything happened to our marriage. It's not relevant to this situation. Actually, it's extremely relevant. Particularly the clauses about marital misconduct and the penalties for attempting to hide assets during divorce proceedings. Elena estimates that your violations could result in you forfeiting up to 75% of all marital assets, including majority control of Hartwell Premium Motors. The sound that came through the phone was somewhere between a gasp and a groan. That can't be right. Victoria, you have to understand that I never intended for things to go this far. Maybe we can work something out privately. I'm afraid that's not possible, Nathaniel. Once you filed for divorce and submitted fraudulent financial disclosures, this became a legal matter that has to be resolved through proper channels. Over. The next several days, I watched Nathaniel's desperation escalate as the true scope of his legal exposure became clear. Richard Caldwell apparently spent considerable time explaining exactly what the post-nuptial agreement meant and how the evidence I had assembled would play out in court. Wednesday morning brought another phone call, this time with Nathaniel's voice completely stripped of its former arrogance. "Victoria, I've been thinking about what you said about working things out reasonably. Maybe I was hasty in filing for divorce. Maybe we should consider marriage counseling instead." The sudden interest in saving our marriage was transparently motivated by financial panic rather than genuine remorse, but I let him continue. "I've been talking to Camille, and I think I may have made some mistakes in judgment. Maybe we could take some time to work on our relationship instead of rushing into divorce." "That's an interesting perspective, Nathaniel. What changed your mind?" "I just think I didn't fully consider what divorce would mean for both of us. Maybe I was going through some kind of midlife crisis or something. The important thing is that we've built a life together, and maybe we shouldn't throw that away over some temporary problems." The complete reversal from his position 5 days earlier would have been amusing if it weren't so transparently desperate. The man who had called me deadweight and claimed I wasn't good enough for his new successful lifestyle was now begging to save our marriage. Thursday brought an even more pathetic attempt at reconciliation. Nathaniel showed up at my office building, waiting in the lobby with an enormous bouquet of flowers and what appeared to be a jewelry box from Meridian's most expensive boutique. "Victoria, please just give me 5 minutes to explain," he pleaded when I emerged from the elevator. "I know I made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can take a vacation, we can do whatever you want to rebuild our marriage." The scene was drawing attention from other professionals in the building, and I could see security guards beginning to take notice of the emotional confrontation in their lobby. "Nathaniel, you filed for divorce. You asked me to move out of our house so your girlfriend could move in. You spent months planning to leave me while systematically hiding assets. What exactly do you think has changed?" "Everything has changed," he said loudly enough that several people stopped to stare. "I realize now that I was being stupid and selfish. Camille doesn't mean anything to me compared to what we have together." The irony of his declaration was breathtaking. 5 days ago, he had praised Camille as sophisticated and beautiful while describing me as worthless. Now that he understood the financial consequences of his actions, she had suddenly become meaningless. "I'm sorry, Nathaniel, but I don't think that's true. And even if it were, the legal process has already begun. Elena has filed our response to your divorce petition, including a complete forensic analysis of your financial misconduct. The court will now determine how your violations of our post-nuptial agreement should be addressed." As I walked away from him standing in the lobby with his desperate gifts, I realized that Nathaniel's world was unraveling exactly as it should. The man who had underestimated me so completely was discovering that his victim was actually his most formidable opponent. The final chapter of Nathaniel's downfall began 3 weeks later in Judge Patricia Thornfield's courtroom at the Meridian Falls Family Court. What should have been a routine divorce proceeding had transformed into something that would be discussed in legal circles for years to come, a masterclass in how thoroughly a case could be destroyed when someone with financial expertise decided to fight back. Elena and I arrived at the courthouse that Tuesday morning carrying 4 boxes of meticulously organized evidence. Across the courtroom, I could see Nathaniel sitting with a new attorney, his third in as many weeks. Richard Caldwell had withdrawn from the case after what Elena described as irreconcilable differences regarding litigation strategy, which Was legal speak for Richard refusing to present arguments he knew were fraudulent. Nathaniel's second attorney had lasted exactly 6 days before also withdrawing, reportedly after discovering additional financial irregularities that Nathaniel had failed to disclose even to his own legal counsel. The man now representing him was a young associate from a less prestigious firm, someone who had apparently been willing to take a case that more experienced attorneys recognized as hopeless. Judge Thornfield was known throughout Meridian Falls as brilliant, thorough, and completely intolerant of financial deception in divorce proceedings. As the former head of the state's Financial Crimes Division, she had a reputation for imposing maximum penalties on parties who attempted to manipulate the legal system through asset concealment or fraudulent documentation. Mrs. Ashcroft, Judge Thornfield began after reviewing the preliminary briefs. I understand you've uncovered significant discrepancies in the financial disclosure provided by the petitioner. Would you care to present your findings? What followed was the most satisfying hour and a half of my professional life. Using the same presentation skills that had helped convict white-collar criminals, I systematically demolished every aspect of Nathaniel's divorce strategy. The evidence was overwhelming: detailed transaction records showing systematic asset transfer, photographic proof of his relationship with Camille funded by marital assets, documentation of shell companies created specifically to hide wealth, and timeline analysis proving that his divorce planning had begun months before our marriage had actually ended. Judge Thornfield's questions were sharp and focused, demonstrating that she understood exactly what she was looking at. Mrs. Ashcroft, in your professional opinion, do these financial transfers represent standard business reorganization or deliberate asset concealment? Your Honor, in my 15 years as a forensic accountant, I have never seen asset concealment executed this systematically outside of major corporate fraud cases. The defendant didn't just hide assets, he created an elaborate financial structure designed specifically to defraud me of my rightful share of marital property. When Nathaniel's attorney attempted to present counterarguments, the inexperience showed immediately. He had no response to the documentary evidence, no explanation for the shell companies, and no credible alternative narrative for the financial timeline I had established. Your Honor, the young lawyer stammered, my client maintains that these business decisions were made for legitimate tax and operational purposes, not to defraud his wife. Judge Thornfield's response was swift and decisive. Counselor, tax planning does not require hiding assets from one's spouse or lying about business valuations in divorce filings. The evidence presented by Mrs. Ashcroft demonstrates clear intent to defraud, and frankly, your client's actions show a level of financial manipulation that borders on criminal behavior. The moment I had been waiting for came when Judge Thornfield turned her attention to the postnuptial agreement and its penalty clauses. Mrs. Ashcroft, please explain to the court how the defendant's actions relate to the financial protections you and your husband agreed to in your postnuptial contract. Your Honor, our agreement specifically states that any party engaging in adultery, financial deception, or asset concealment would forfeit their right to spousal support and would be liable for penalty payments equal to 25% of the value of concealed assets. Based on my analysis, the defendant concealed approximately $2.3 million in assets and spent $127,000 of marital funds on his extramarital affair. The calculation was simple but devastating. Under the terms of the agreement that Nathaniel himself had insisted upon, his violations would cost him over $700,000 in penalties alone, on top of the standard asset division that would award me 60%. Of all marital property, Judge Thornfield spent 20 minutes reviewing the postnuptial agreement and the evidence before delivering her ruling. The court finds that the petitioner, Nathaniel Hartwell, has systematically violated the terms of his postnuptial agreement through adultery, financial deception, and deliberate asset concealment. These actions represent a clear breach of his fiduciary duty as a spouse and constitute fraud against the respondent. What came next exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Therefore, the court awards the respondent, Victoria Ashcroft, 65% of all marital assets, including 65% ownership of Hartwell Premium Motors and its subsidiary companies. The petitioner is ordered to pay penalty damages of $575,000 for asset concealment, plus $127,000 in restitution for the misuse of marital funds. Additionally, the petitioner is prohibited from claiming any spousal support and is responsible for all court costs and legal fees for both parties. The sound that escaped from Nathaniel when the ruling was announced was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. In trying to cheat me out of a fair settlement, he had lost not only his business but also his home, his investments, and his financial future, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, the court is referring this case to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential criminal charges related to financial fraud. The systematic nature of the asset concealment suggests that Mr. Hartwell's actions may have violated state laws regarding fraudulent transfer of assets. As we left the courthouse, I couldn't help but reflect on the perfect justice of the situation. Nathaniel had dismissed my career as meaningless, called me dead weight, and assumed I would be helpless without him. Instead, he had challenged someone whose entire professional life was built on uncovering exactly the kind of deception he had attempted. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. Within 60 days, I had taken operational control of Hartwell Premium Motors, which was now valued at over $4.2 million thanks to the contracts Nathaniel had tried to hide. The luxury car dealerships that had been his pride and joy were now primarily mine, and I discovered that I had a genuine talent for business management when I wasn't being undermined and dismissed. Nathaniel, meanwhile, faced a very different reality. The criminal investigation resulted in charges for fraudulent asset transfer and tax evasion related to his shell company scheme. While he avoided jail time through a plea agreement, the financial penalties and legal fees left him essentially bankrupt. The house in Willowbrook Heights had to be sold to pay court-ordered damages, and he was forced to move into a modest apartment on the other side of town. The consequences extended beyond just financial ruin. Camille Richardson, who had apparently been impressed by Nathaniel's wealth and status, disappeared from his life the moment his financial situation became public knowledge. The sophisticated, beautiful woman who was supposed to be his perfect partner had no interest in a man facing criminal charges and bankruptcy. The business community in Meridian Falls learned the story quickly, and Nathaniel found himself professionally ostracized. Nobody wanted to do business with someone who had been exposed as willing to lie, cheat, and steal from his own wife. The reputation he had spent years building was destroyed in a matter of weeks. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I received a letter from Nathaniel, handwritten, desperate, and pathetic. He begged for a chance to work together on the business, claimed he had learned his lesson, and suggested that we could rebuild something positive from our shared history. The letter was signed with love, Nathaniel, as if we were still the married couple he had destroyed with his arrogance and cruelty. I never responded to that letter. Today, nearly 2 years later, I run a thriving business empire that includes not only the expanded Hartwell Premium Motors but also a consulting firm specializing in forensic accounting for high-asset divorces. My professional reputation has grown exponentially, and I'm frequently called upon to help other spouses who have discovered financial deception in their marriages. As for Nathaniel, I occasionally hear updates through mutual acquaintances. He works as a sales manager at a used car lot in Eastbridge, making a fraction of what he once earned. He lives alone in his small apartment, and according to those who've seen him, he looks considerably older and more worn than his 52 years. The man who once told me I wasn't good enough for his success discovered too late that I wasn't just good enough, I was the one person he should never have underestimated. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just living well, it's using your professional skills to ensure that justice is served with mathematical precision. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.